board, and I kept, every time it would hit it, the board would kind of go back, so I couldn't get pressure. And then I looked back after the service, and it wasn't hooked. The back leg wasn't set. So it kind of, but it worked. It was just fine. So today we're going to finish up Genesis 37, and we're going to go 18 through 36. This is the beginning of Joseph, our story on Joseph. And next chapter, chapter 38, will be one chapter on Judah, and then we will be going back to Joseph for the rest of the book of Genesis. There's a lot, about 25% of the book of Genesis is regarding Joseph. So he's a very important character in the Word of God. And his life is interesting. I preached on the devotion that I had written a couple weeks ago on Joseph and how he was chosen. How his father told him to go on a trip, just like you and I, when we get saved, we're set on a journey. And in that journey will be a lot of dangers, traps, and things like that. There'll be good days and bad days and all of that. So the first part, the first 17 verses of Genesis chapter 37 is the story of Joseph, and he had dreams. And if you remember, he was beloved of his father. Now I believe, and there's some people that disagree with this, I believe Rachel had died before this chapter. And so Benjamin was there, and Bilhah was probably taking care of Benjamin. He was just a baby. Joseph was 17 years of age, and Joseph began to have dreams. And we say, well, why would you tell people your dreams when you know it's going to make them mad? You know, one of his dreams was he's talking about going out in a wheat field, and you know how they would take I love these sickles, these scythes. I don't like to use them, but I like to look at them, you know. And they would cut the wheat, then bundle it up. And he said, my bundle would stood up, and the rest of the bundles were gathered around and would worship my bundle, basically, is what he's saying. And it's like, yeah, well, they hated him already because his father loved him, made him a coat of many colors. And you know, sometimes the last child born, sometimes my brother, he got away with stuff I could never get away with. No, I mean, I'm serious. I mean, he's 7 years younger. I could never get away with the stuff that he got away with. So he was special, you know. And so Joseph was special in his father's sight, and it irritated the other brothers. And then he had another dream, and that dream included his mom and dad, and the sun and the moon, and even they were going to bow down to him. And he said them, and you know, you say to yourself, why would you do that? I mean, you already know your brothers don't like you. Why would you do that? But all of that is a part of the sovereignty of God. Because there's going to be a time coming as we get into the latter chapters that we're going to see that they do bow down to him. And it will come to their mind the dreams that he had. And so all of this is for a purpose. We don't sometimes understand it, and we think, you know, man, what a silly boy to mention that. And he was, and yet he wasn't. And then we find that his father sends him out as a 17-year-old boy on a journey. Now, you know, I mentioned at the church up there, I found a 17-year-old Caleb. I don't know if you know Caleb. Yeah. And he's like 16 or 17. And so I said, Caleb, your father's sending you on a trip up to Elkhart. Take off now. And, you know, and you're going to walk it, you know. 50-mile journey he had to go, Joseph had to go. That's in the night, in the daytime. I mean, a 17-year-old boy. And you say, well, that's awful young. Well, I went in the Navy when I was 17, so maybe I can relate a little bit. I don't know. But it's just still young. But it was a test for his son. His father was testing his son to see what kind of metal he was made out of. And of course, you know the story. We're going to finish the story today. He went out a place and he found, he went to Shechem where he thought where his dad said that's where they were, taking care of the animals. Now, I think about this as something, you remember what happened in Shechem earlier, right? Simeon and Levi, Dinah got raped by the mayor's son, and Simeon and Levi went in and killed all the men of Shechem. I don't know if I was headed back to Shechem. I don't know if I was in Shechem. I would have a little bit of fear that Jacob's family was coming. Jacob owns land in Shechem. Now, that's the only land that Israel bought, except for Abraham. He bought a little piece of land and a graveyard, or a area to bury Sarah. And now we know that Sarah was born with Abraham, and Jacob and Isaac and Rebekah are born there, and Jacob and Leah are buried there. I'm sorry, not born there. So there was only like 2 pieces of land. That one, Joseph actually will come back and be buried there in Shechem when they bring his bones back. So now we find that he went there. He's in a field wandering, kind of like you and I in our life sometimes. We get into a stale spot where we're like, what do I do next? Or where am I going to go? Or, something happens and it stops our momentum and we find ourselves wandering. He was in a field wandering, and a man came up and said, what are you doing? I'm hunting my brothers. And he said they're in Dothan, so you got to walk another 15 miles to get to the brothers. So that's another day he's got to go to get to his brothers. And that means that's 65 miles away from where his father was. Joseph took off on the rest of that journey. And as we take up the story today, in verse number 18, and we find that as Joseph is coming up on the family in Dothan. Now, Dothan was I'll get into that in just a minute. But let's just read a few verses here, and then we'll get more into it. Verse number 18, and when they saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. Now, what kind of brothers is this? It's again, we have to look at this in 2 lights. I want you to see this as the human standpoint of what's all is happening here, and how could this possibly be happening, and then we have to look at it as the sovereignty of God aspect. God is moving things the way he wants them to be moved, and it's just amazing as we see the hand of God move through history. But here these boys and now Simeon and Levi has no problem killing anybody. It's amazing how a murderer can murder once. Well, after that, it's not a problem. There may have been a mental problem to pull the trigger the first time. It's kind of like these guys go in a store and rob a store, and they might kill the guy. One guy might. Well, after that guy, he's a murderer, and he has nothing to lose, and he probably will go on and kill somebody else. They don't have a conscience about it. And I'm saying Simeon and Levi at this point, they don't have a conscience about murder, the way they killed the people in Shechem. And so I'm sure they might have been some of the instigators in it. We also know that Zilpah and Bilhah, the handmaids of Rachel and Leah, this is who Joseph went on. Joseph went to the fields with them one time and went back and told his father all the bad things that they were doing. He was a snitch. Joseph did not try to endear himself to anybody, but maybe Papa. So, but again, look at this in the light of the sovereignty of God and also the humanity of man. And so we see there, and they said one to another, behold, the dreamer cometh. So here's the motive, right? Here's the motive. They see him coming. Now, how do they know it's him? What in the world? What would ever, in their wildest dream, think that Joseph would be 65 miles from home walking in the middle of a field? You see what I'm saying? How did they know? Well, we find out later he was wearing a coat of many colors. Now, let me say this. When I go deer hunting, I will not be wearing my suit. Why are you wearing this coat of many colors? Are you doing it to spite them when they see you, that you are feeling superior because your dad likes you more than he likes them? We're not told. I don't know why Joseph did it. But we will find out that he did. So let's just go now and get into our notes. And they said, let us slay him. To me, I marvel at this. And it says, and cast him. That word cast there, it means to fling him. What I'm trying to say is they were not going to let him gently down a pit. Now, these were water cisterns. They would, in these areas where they had rain in the spring, they would cut out and dig deep cisterns for the water to go into. And then they could get out of that and get water for the animals and things like that, right? And so their idea was literally to kill him and throw him in the pit. They had no intentions of being kind, nice, and generous in any aspect of this. This was cruel murder that they had in their minds. Now, we're going to see two men come into play here. In verse number 21, Reuben heard it. Who was Reuben? Reuben was the firstborn of Leah. And then you had Simeon and Levi, and then you had Judah. And, of course, all the rest of these, the Zilpah and Bilhah and Rachel. Actually, Joseph was of Rachel, and then Benjamin was of Rachel. But all of the rest of these two here were murderers. At the time we're writing this story, this is coming out, these two here are murderers. They have no conscience about murder. And it would be, and some of the Hebrew writers and the Torah and different books indicate that Simeon may have been one of the instigators of the murder aspect of this. So we find now that Reuben, who is the firstborn, now the firstborn, Reuben, would be expected to take over the family. And the firstborn would get a double portion, and the firstborn would become the spiritual leader of the family. Now, Reuben has a problem that we find out in chapter 48. Does anybody remember what the problem was? He thought it was a good idea to have an affair with Bilhah. That booted him out of the number one plan for Jacob. Jacob, Israel. And so, but Reuben heard of it. And so I think that the men that were instigating this were Simeon and Levi. Judah and Reuben are going to be involved in what will be an attempt to rescue Joseph. And Reuben heard of it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. So it appears that Reuben went over and got a hold of Joseph and said, let's don't kill him. Let's don't kill him. And Reuben said unto them, shed no blood, but cast him in the pit that's in the wilderness. And that even sounds pretty cruel. But you have to understand, I think, the character of Simeon and Levi. I think this plays a big part. These guys want to kill him, and they have no problems killing him. And I'm sure that Gad and Asher and Dan and Naphtali, of these boys that Joseph went and tattletaled on, I'm sure they didn't have a lot of problem in that aspect either. They weren't going to hold him back. So Joseph had made enemies. And so Reuben, instead of saying, no, you guys are not going to do that, Joseph, pack up your ditty bag and get back home. But instead of doing that, he said, let's throw him in a pit. Let's cast him in a pit. Now, he had an ulterior motive in doing that. Reuben said unto them, shed no blood, but cast him in the pit. It's in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands and deliver him unto his father. So what this is saying is, Reuben's intentions were to get him in a pit. Reuben left the family, as they're going to have supper here in a little bit, while their brother's in the pit, pretty much naked. They've taken his coat and his garments, and they've thrown him in the pit. Reuben's intention was to go out and maybe work with the herd a little bit, and as darkness come and the guys began to rest, he was going to go back and get Joseph out of the pit and send him back to the father. That's his intentions. Shed no blood. So the first object is to keep the guys from killing him. Joseph was captured, placed in a pit. It said it came to pass when Joseph was come unto his brethren, that they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors. This is the first time we are finding that he's wearing that coat that would distinguish him as the favorite of his father. You know, I don't think that he was the favorite of his father. I think he was spoiled. But a father loves all their children, right? I mean, you should love all your children. I'm sure he loved Reuben and Simeon and Levi. He probably had a big problem with Simeon and Levi right now after they did what they did in Shechem. But actually, all the guys got involved in that. At the end, they went in and ravaged the place. But they took him, cast him in the pit. Pit was empty. There was no water. So it was an empty cistern, basically. We used to have cisterns when I was a boy growing up that we kept water. I cleaned a cistern out one time and wondered how could we drink water from that thing. But we did. It's amazing how we survived. I literally drank water out of a hose. One thing left at one of the houses that I went back to one of the houses where a little farmhouse that we had with a barn and fields, and there was one thing left, and I wanted to jump the fence and go see if I could get it, and it was the pump well. That was just sitting out in the field all by itself, and I had pumped many gallons of water out of that pump, and I thought, oh, I want that. Well, these are just empty cisterns. And they sit down to eat bread. This is, they just threw their brother in the, not just their brother, but their baby brother. I mean, this is not just their brother. This is their baby brother. This is the one that they should protect, right? That's your responsibility, is to take care of your younger siblings. It's your responsibility to do that. Let me say another thing here, is these boys were not a big fan of Rachel because of the love Joseph had for Rachel than Leah. Jacob spent all of his time with Rachel. She gave him permission to go visit Leah from time to time, or Bilhah, or Zilpah, or however all that worked. But his main love was Rachel. And she had just recently died, giving birth to Benjamin. And so these guys, they didn't have a real favorable outlook towards Joseph and Benjamin. And so here we find that they lifted up their eyes, looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead, with their camels bearing spices and balms and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. So we have a traveling band. In another verse, we're going to find that there are Midianites also that are with them. Now, whether they were a group that were gathered, they had a lot of expensive things that they were carrying. And you don't do that with one person, two people, 3 or 4 people. You would have a caravan. That way you would not be robbed as you're going from one place to another. There were a lot of thieves and robbers. Actually, some of the Midianites that we're going to be talking about were robbers themselves. That's how they lived. And so the Ishmaelites came from Gilead. Now, I think this is interesting. So, I mean, that nobody is saying this in our text, but the Ishmaelites are the first cousins of these boys. They're cousins. Abraham had 2 sons. Well, he had 8 sons. He had Ishmael first, and that was through Hagar and that sinful relationship that they had. And then he had Isaac, right? So he had Isaac and he had Ishmael. Ishmael went and so these were Ishmaelites. These were the sons of Ishmael. Ishmael probably hadn't been dead very long if he was still dead, if he was dead. But they were big cousins, right? So there might have been some influence there in that. And this is just me thinking that by giving Jacob or Joseph to them, they might have cared for him a little better than just some other traveling group that comes through. If they're cousins and if they had some kind of relationship, if they knew that, I mean, it talks about they knew they were Ishmaelites, right? So they knew they were of Abraham's son Ishmael. And so being cousins, and hopefully, and I think that they might have been a little more kind to Joseph. And this may be why Joseph was able to get bought by someone with authority. They may have, because he was family, they may have taken care of him. I don't know. Doesn't say. But we know God, again, is in control. And Judah said to his brethren, whoa, wait a minute. We've been talking about Reuben. Judah is going to begin to step out in our history as we go through. And we're going to see that Reuben tries to be the leader, but Judah will end up being the leader here as they go into Egypt. And so this is one of those places where Judah steps up and says, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Now, that word, conceal his blood, it means that once you kill, if I was to kill somebody, that would be on my mind. His blood, the fact that I killed somebody would be on my mind forever. And we're going to see when they go to go back to Jacob, and they see how he mourns the loss of his son. I can't help but believe the kids, they mourned with him. Not because they knew what happened, but they were mourning because their father would be mourning. And so Judah steps in and he says, well, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and let not our hand be upon him. In other words, let's put it in God's hand, right? Let's put him, here again, why didn't Judah say, let me take that boy home to his dad? These guys feared somebody. And I have to believe they feared Simeon and Levi. I'm serious, because they've been up around Shechem. It wasn't that long ago that they killed all the men in Shechem. And those are the two boys that did it. They already have blood on their hands. They don't care. What's another life, right? Even though it's family, I can't help but believe, why wouldn't Judah or why wouldn't Reuben say, give me that boy, I'm taking him home? Another situation I think about here is if they killed the boy, they might have to kill Reuben and Judah, because they're going to go back home and tell Daddy the truth. Or are they? Anyways, they sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh, and his brethren were content. So they said, okay, let's get rid of him, but we won't kill him, but let's get rid of him. And they passed by Midianites. Now, it says Ishmaelites in one place, Midianites in another place. Abraham had Hagar, and she had Ishmael. And he also, after the death of Sarah, had a woman named Keturah. And she had 6 children, one of which was the Midianites. And the Kenites, they were all from this, whom Moses ended up marrying into that family. So this is still a part of the family, right? And so the Ishmaelites and the Midianites were probably gathered together, cousins, and they're all moving their stuff together, traveling down the intercoastal highway there. And Reuben returned unto the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit. And he rent his clothes. And he returned unto his brethren and said, the child is not, and I, whither shall I go? In other words, he carried the responsibility of the care of that child. Actually, he carried the responsibility of the care of all the children. He was the eldest. He was the one that would be responsible to his father for any one of those that was killed, and especially the one his father loved. What am I going to do? Where did he go? As a matter of fact, we don't really see where they told him what they did with him. I believe he finds out, but it doesn't say anything about that. And they took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped it in blood. And they sent the coat of many colors. Now, those words are interesting. They didn't take it. They sent it. They sent somebody ahead of them before they got home. Can you get the picture? I want you to get the picture. They sent a servant with the coat to tell Jacob or Israel that this is what they found. And actually, Jacob is the one that said he had been torn apart by wild beasts. They didn't say that. They just brought the coat and said, do you recognize this coat? The boys came later while the father is mourning the loss. And they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, this have we found. That's the servants found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. And he knew it, and it was his son's coat. And he says, an evil beast hath devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. What a horrible thought for a father of one of the children that he loved so much. That's the way he thought of Joseph. There are some people that believe he mourned for the whole 22 years before he met his son in Egypt. Jacob rent his clothes, put on sackcloth on his loins, mourned for son many days. That's the first time we have in the Bible where this is how they mourned, putting sackcloth. So basically, he took off the fine clothing and put on rough clothing, a gunny sack, if you please. How would you like to have gunny sack underwear? Okay, I'll stop right there. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up. Now, all his daughters, we only know of Dinah, but he had a lot of daughter-in-laws. And some believe he had daughters also. Rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "For I will go down into my grave unto my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. I just, you almost feel for Joseph right now. He has this picture of his son torn in pieces by a wild animal. That's what he has, and that's what he will carry with him for the next 22 years until he sees Joseph. And then I will not be able to understand the feeling that he had that day. The joy, this horror that he has right now will be turned into joy. And the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. So the sovereignty of God is moving. He knows, and God, all-knowing, sees the history that's coming and has planned a plan and has put that together. Nobody knows that. Nobody sees that until, we go through life. God has given us a plan. We don't know what, I'm 81. I don't know what my plan's not over, right? At least yet. I'm breathing. I know Charlie. Charlie wished I would stop breathing right now. Father, we thank you so much for the Word of God. Thank you for these lessons in history that give us a look into your precious Word. We just thank you, Lord. Bless the services this morning. And God, I pray you'll use